So take a look at this. This is William Shakespeare. Literally. This is him getting his vaccine. The UK has been rolling out the vaccines basically today, and the first few were being rolled out. This is William Shakespeare getting, quote unquote, the jab. He's getting the jab. Of course, they're giving it to people who are more susceptible to the illness. Let's say like nursing home residents, people who may work in these frontline jobs like nurses and doctors and so forth. And so Pfizer, BioNTech are basically rolling this out. Interestingly enough, the United States apparently purchased 100,000 doses, but it's a two-tier formula, so it's basically 50 million doses. Well, we have 300 it's odd million people in this country at any given moment. And so clearly that's not necessarily enough. The story also came out today that Trump or his administration turned down and declined getting more of the drug. Now, the reason this became somewhat of an issue is because basically, if you're looking at these other companies and countries, they're also going to want the COVID medication. And if the United States is basically turning down receiving as much of it as you can possibly get, America first, then that's kind of problematic, especially when the companies start making contracts with other countries to supply those countries with their drug. Now, Russia has basically started their Sputnik V. They have been putting out several doses, actually, for the last month or so. It might even be a little bit before. And so they're basically monitoring to ensure that it's working. And I would imagine that the drug companies are also watching these people to ensure that it works. Whatever studies these guys were doing, you can understand that the studies were, truncated, right? They would have to be for you to finish up a drug this fast in that short span of time. And that truncated medication, I would imagine there are questions about how it works for kids, certain adults, certain people with comorbidities, meaning certain illnesses. I know for myself that there were certain vaccines that I wasn't necessarily allowed to get because they didn't necessarily want to take the chance that an active version of the vaccine can inhibit or make the person worse off. So all of these questions may be up for grabs, but at the very least, in the very few moments right now, these people are getting vaccinated. And I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing, especially if the vaccine does what the vaccine is supposed to do. So turning down supplies looks bad. And I suspect that part of the reason the information was leaked was to make Trump look that much worse. How could the president that's talking about America first turn down vaccines for Americans? Oh, he's an ogre. So, of course, that's why the information would come out in order to ding Trump. And to be honest, the information could even be cut in a political way, meaning they only got 50 million doses. And because they didn't get more, they basically didn't get the contracts for the company, meaning this could be cast in political terms. However you look at it, it looks bad to have information out there that the administration didn't see to it that Americans were going to be covered by an American drug company's drug first. Is what it is, right? This also comes on the heels of the United States hitting the most brutal milestone that it has hit from the standpoint of number of people who've died from COVID. Now, I don't spend a huge amount of time doing COVID deaths. I think I did when I first started, but after a while, the numbers are so repetitive. And you get the situation where channels on television basically keep the numbers up constantly. People talk about it constantly. We even talk about it on fault lines. But I do want to talk about it today because the numbers are staggering. And you need to understand what these look like in real terms. Because what we see from the standpoint of the COVID numbers and for what we see from the standpoint of the hospitals being slammed and the hospitals being full doesn't really get to the full story. I mean, if those hospitals are full, what does it mean for cancer patients? What does it mean for people with AIDS, breaks, illnesses? What does it mean for older people who are dealing with medical illnesses? My grandmother, she's in her last days. She can't go to the hospital. We don't trust her going to the hospital. And the fact of the matter is, even if she went, my mom wouldn't be able to be there and the family wouldn't be able to be there. It's dramatic and radical in regards to the changes that we have to make in our society in order to accommodate it. And because we are so lambasted by it, especially in America, it squeezes out other vital functions. The hospitals right now are being slammed, not to mention the ICUs. This is all across the United States because, if I'm not mistaken, every state at this point is a hotspot, at least in continental U.S. So I want to go into just the extraordinary numbers that we've hit, the milestones that we've hit in this. And I also want to bring up a study that has come out recently this week, Germany, talking about the efficacy of masks. You get a lot of people who talk a lot of nonsense because they don't want to wear masks. It's one thing to say it is my liberty to wear a mask, but they go further and then try to denigrate the usefulness or the efficacy of the mask and basically bring questions under this guise of science, critiquing actual science. It's utterly astonishing and it's horrible. And people who do that are dirtball human beings because basically what they're doing is putting doubt into something that actually works. Why do you think doctors wear masks? Do you think they're doing it just for shits and giggles? Why do you think nurses wear masks? Do you think they're doing it for shits and giggles? When these people are walking around the hospital and you have to ensure that what you have don't go into the patient and vice versa, meaning you're trying to ensure the protection of that nurse so that nurse can go home to her family member that night, or that doctor can go home to a family member, and you yourself don't get infected by it. I mean, it's ludicrous. There's some of the stuff that these guys were saying. So, in case the other studies that came out in the Lancet didn't do it, here's another one in Germany showing 45% reduction within the course of 20 days of using a mask. Think about that, what that would have meant in the beginning. Think about states like Texas. Think of the Midwest, like the Sturgis Festival that took place. And they can now show definitively that people that were at the Sturgis Festival became super spreaders. Of course, why wouldn't they, right? You have a pandemic going on. You have people at the place. Those people who are there don't think they're infected because nobody ever thinks they're infected until they're actually infected. And they're passing it. Some of them don't even know they're passing it. They're just having a great time toasting drinks, giving that other person something that's going to kill them or somebody in their family. And they go about bumping uglies and so forth, passing it all, to each other, turning this country into a petri dish. Are we really shocked that the numbers are like this? Well, I'm making a point that German study makes the point that masks do indeed, once again, to confirm for another time, they work. Welcome, Dreary Soapbox. My name is Jamarl Thomas. This is the Progressive Soapbox. Guys, if you dig this content, please like, share, and subscribe. Also, you can always support this content through PayPal or Patreon. I like to say this content is brought to you by you, and I appreciate you for allowing me to do what I do. You allow me to sit here and do the news. Take a look at this. This is grim, but I have my point that I'm trying to make. These are totals. Notice the date and notice the numbers. November 16th, 176,752 people infected. November 17th, 159,000. November 18th, 167,000. November 19th, 193,000. November 20th, 196,000. November 23rd, 176,000. 173, 183, 124. That was a low day. And then back up to 192. Eventually, you get to December and these numbers 204, 219, 214. Those numbers are disastrous. Those are human beings, just like you and me, being infected with a particular virus. Do you realize that many of the people that are getting the virus, I think it's like 1 in 3, talk about cognitive function, cognitive impairment immediately after having the virus? People talk about issues that they have, like either pain or aches or difficulties that go months after having the virus. Meaning it's not enough to just be like, it's a cold. It's not acting in people like a cold. Certain comorbidities, these things seem to make worse. Inflammation, it seems to make worse. And so people have this idea that it's like the flu. The people who get it don't come out saying it's like the flu unless they have a political agenda in mind. The United States, right here, New York Times, with a 7-day average of 2,249 deaths, the country broke the previous mark of 2,232 deaths set on April 17th. We're in what, December 8th? And back in April was the last time we've hit numbers like this. So right here, the United States is approaching 300,000 total deaths with nearly 283,000 recorded deaths, according to the New York Times. The nation is averaging nearly 200,000 cases per day, an increase of 15% from the average 2 weeks earlier, and has recorded over 15 million cases. So it's not just a number that is somewhat stagnant and not going down. It's more so the rate at which the cases are accelerating. So it's infection rate, and then these things seem to proliferate, and it's growing at this kind of increase, rapid pace. It's not just velocity, it's acceleration. It's making the point that it's up nearly 15% over an average from just 2 weeks ago. It's spiking, it's escalating. Part of it is because it's getting cold and people are being stuck in the house, and when they're being stuck in the house, they're passing it around a little bit more, especially if they're in locations. They're not necessarily out there jogging and whatnot. Also, I would imagine there may be other flu-like items that go along with this, or cold-like things that go along with this. So they're expecting it to get worse, especially after Thanksgiving and Christmas with the holidays, as people go and mingle and basically spread the infection about. They don't expect this to get better. They expect it to get worse. And we're already at the worst. 2,885 people died on Wednesday. Put that in. 2,885 people died Wednesday. That number is extraordinary. I mean, we were seeing numbers like 2,500 people dying a day. On top of that, they did an investigation. They found over 300,000 excess deaths. Now, that word is misleading because there's always a certain number of excess deaths just because the population is pretty much always growing. And so there's always an expectation in regards to the number of additional people who die per year. But that may be like 100,000. We're at 300,000. There's like 200,000 more excess deaths than would be expected otherwise. Meaning the number for the COVID-19 and the number of people who they're saying dying is probably too low. There's some people who just not being counted. Like, I'm trying to get across the severity of this because people act as if this is some kind of flu. 15 million total cases of COVID-19 has been recorded. Many of the hardest hit counties on a per person basis are now in the Midwest. So basically you had places like California and you had New York slammed. New York especially was being hit pretty hard. Cuomo has lost like 20,000, 30,000 people, and yet he gets lauded as some kind of hero. California has also been hit. I don't think California has ever really reopened, even though they've tried. Many of the states that opened have now started to hunker down again and reclose, including the state where we're in, Maryland. In the Midwest, it says North Dakota, where 1 in every 10 residents has contracted the virus, has the highest total reported cases by population, followed by South Dakota, Iowa, Wisconsin, and Nebraska. It moved to the Midwest. This is something that the doctors kept saying, right? Just because you're in an area that is not necessarily full of COVID now doesn't necessarily mean that people, or that it won't flow. People tend to move around. And the way that those people move around, the virus has a tendency to flow and go out into the population. It's not standing still because people don't necessarily stand still. To put that in perspective, so you see how that looks, take a look at this. These are the ICUs or beds, hospital beds that are occupied. Let's see if I can make this bigger. This is in August 7th. This is November 27th. Hospital beds. These are ICUs. And again, August 7th. And percentage of ICU beds full, November 27th. The hospitals and the staff are basically not able to keep up. The morgues are not able to keep up. I've shown you the pictures of the refrigerator trucks where prison inmates are basically moving bodies because the morgues are so full and they didn't have anything to do with the bodies. Hospitals have gotten to the point of making basically emergency decisions or triage decisions. Decisions of that person is too old, we can't keep that person alive, that younger person has a better chance, okay, let's use our resources for that person. That's where we are. We didn't have to be this way. We could have dumped money into their hospitals. We could have had an American medical complex, not where people are putting arm and legs into trying to make that thing work or just pay off their medical bills. I'm talking about where we invested into our hospital. We had something like a Medicare for all. We had these hospitals that were ready and prepared and stocked. And it wasn't based on this notion of profit. And so masks aren't profitable to make, so masks aren't made. Ventilators aren't profitable to make, so the cheapest ventilator is not necessarily made. No, it was all done for profit. And our capitalistic system with horrible leadership failed miserably to deal with this challenge. I'm making the very basic point that it didn't have to be this way. Even when it became clear, even when you could see what China was doing, China was building 2 hospitals within the course of like 2 weeks. I mean, even the way Russia was doing, they were shutting down borders and investing into their hospitals, into their healthcare. We had months to do that. We chose not to. We're just basically reaping policy failures of not just this administration, but I'm sorry, this is a capitalistic fuck-up of sorts from the standpoint of the incentives that were built into it. I mean, Donald Trump's main purpose, we got to get the economy back up and running. People mattered less, right? Even from the standpoint of the medical supplies and everything else. His priority wasn't to force corporations to make supplies that were in the interest of the American public. His priority wasn't to ensure that the bills of the hospital care was paid for and all this other stuff. His priority was the economy. He believed that he was going to live and die on the economy, missing the point that the reason that economy hit the skids was COVID. Period. And that the American public was giving you a pass if you would have dealt with the virus. Period. Part of that was wearing masks. But Trump considered masks unmanly. And so he chose not to do that. This ends up biting him in 2 ways. You have a large number of people who die. That is not great for your electoral chances. You have tens of millions that get affected, like 50 million at this point that get affected. That is not great for your electoral chances. On top of that, you weren't even to accomplish the objective that you set for yourself, meaning getting the economy up and running. That hit the skids with 20 to 30 million people out of a job. Healthcare, you did on some level was successful because you did try to get rid of healthcare for a lot of people, and you had 10, 15 million people that basically lost their healthcare during this crisis because when they lost their job, their healthcare went along with it. None of these things are great for electoral chances. What would have been great for his electoral chances was Medicare for all of everyone with that COVID. This was something that Trump himself floated. Medicare for everyone with COVID. He would have been far better ahead of the game if he would have been able to do something like that, or at the very least push legitimately something like that. I'm making the point that these decisions were basically made for the economy, believing that that's his best electoral chances. Whereas really the choices that he was making was basically ass backwards. He was missing the point on so many levels. And then the mask issue is the most embarrassing. If Donald Trump would have started off with people wearing masks and pushed for people to wear masks, and his supporters would have ended up wearing masks because Trump said to wear masks, and liberals would have worn masks because, they're liberals, he would have had a far better chance of winning this election. A, like I said before, on all of those other negative factors would not have been present. But B, in-person voting versus absentee voting. Republicans have done a lot of work, voter ID laws, making lines longer, closing polling locations, making sure that people have longer times to wait so those people will fade off, making it easier for people who they believe would vote for their favor, but making it more difficult in certain areas that don't vote Democrat. Well, you've spent years constructing a system like that, but you fuck it up in one go the moment you get a virus that the President of the United States does not attend to, that many of the states don't attend to, especially these southern states and these Midwestern states. They don't attend to this issue. They think it's a real man to not wear a mask. And what happens? All of them inundated with the virus. The majority of the public says, yes, people should wear a mask. The majority of the public says, yes, those buildings should stay closed with the exception of certain things. Trump against all of it. And what ends up happening? The various states that Trump needs to win makes the argument, hey, it seems unsafe for people to go to the polling locations. I think people should vote by mail. And the other Democrats say, yeah, I like that. I like that. And the public says, yeah, we agree. I don't want to risk my life to go make that vote. And you have Democrats in the back saying, because what they know is that all of the infrastructure that Republicans have spent that time making to get rid of votes and peel away votes basically gets eliminated the moment that people can just sit in their house and vote by mail. You're looking and trying to figure out why Joe Biden got so many more votes, because people who would have never went to the polling locations could basically mail their vote in for Joe Biden. You allowed the argument. That wasn't Biden and Democrats, that was you! You allowed these numbers. These numbers are atrocious in regards to the number of people that are dying. So yes, why wouldn't you, if you were a Democrat, make the argument, hey, I think people should mail in their ballots. That's what I think. I'm going to bail. COVID is really bad. Wear your mask, etc., but I think people should mail in their ballots. Yes, if you're trying to figure out how you lost this race, the buck stopped with you, buddy. This mask study in Germany, the German mask study basically makes the point that 45% reduction in new COVID cases. Now, this is peer-reviewed, and this is just one of many studies. It's just the latest peer-reviewed study to come along. And this study is looking at it from the standpoint of Germany, and it's fair to say that there may be contours. And so the number may be higher than 45%. You might get 75% depending on where you are, depending on the level of adherence you have to the mask policy, how close people are packed in, the country that people are in, the climate that people are in. All of those things are variables. That's true. But the basic and the core premise of the study shows that like 45% reduction in 20 days of people wearing the mask diligently. If Donald Trump would have started off with a mask policy early on and stuck to that mask policy, and maybe a shutdown for maybe a month or two with people getting their ends and everything else, Donald Trump would have won this presidency handedly. He wouldn't have even cared whether or not it was mail-in ballots. The fact of the matter is, you wouldn't have even needed to make the case for mail-in ballots. You could have made a stronger case against it the moment that you get to the point where COVID is not a main issue. Shot yourself in the foot, dude. Call it unmanly if you want. Joke Joe Biden if you want. Joe Biden is now the president of the United States, or he will be in 1 or 2 months. So there's that. I'm making the point of putting the study here on Forbes, but the study is basically pretty straightforward. It's looking at the numbers in regards to the number of people who are getting infected versus not. And they basically come to straight conclusions. The P&A study finds that masks could reduce the number of COVID-19 infections 20 days after the mandatory introductions, anywhere from 15% to 75%, depending on the region. The reduction in new cases was the most for those above the age of 60. Researchers clarified that the results might change based on climate conditions of different countries as well as local regulations. They added that in Germany, rules for tests are uniform, and so they did not factor in differences in testing. But that's almost like neither here nor there. Basically, they're making the point that in a controlled condition or in these conditions, we were able to determine that, yes, masks work. And there may be contours to wherever you live, your environment, and everything else. But at the very least, at the core, at basic level, we know they work, especially for people who are over 60. And I suspect that number would get higher if people weren't messing with their face, with their eye, more fidgeted, and those type of things. But I'm just making the point, they work. It was understood they worked before. They work. If Trump would have just, if he was manly enough to do the unmanly thing. I like that. If Trump was manly enough to do the unmanly thing, Trump would be president right now. But Trump was too much of a girly man to be able to be manly enough to do the unmanly thing in order to win the White House. He didn't love America enough, like Newt Gingrich did, to wear the mask. Look, this, I hate to tell you, this is not going to get better anytime soon. Trump, his hand is off the steering wheel. And like I said, even when it comes down to this notion of getting the vials, getting the vaccines. Now, Trump and his administration said that's not true. And they say they're almost at the point of securing, I guess, another tranche of the vaccines, despite the commitments that the companies have to the other countries that wanted it when Trump basically said he wasn't going to give it. And one more point. Trump had nothing to do with the vaccine creation. They're calling this Operation Warp Speed and all this other nonsense. There was no money that went to the vaccine creation. The company did it, basically, they're saying, on their own, which is the reason why it came out after the election, because they weren't going to give Trump credit for something that he had didn't deserve any for. So I'm going to say like, I'm going to say share, and I am going to say subscribe. Make sure you hit the subscription button. Make sure you hit the bell so you're notified when I have videos. I tend to pop in and out all throughout the course of the day and night. I tend to be an insomniac. But, you know, very clearly, Donald Trump should have been man enough to do the unmanly thing for America. If he indeed loved America, he would have been willing to be man enough to do the unmanly thing. Sucks for him. Like, share, and subscribe. Or maybe I should say sucks for us, because at the end of it, we're still near 300,000 deaths. I keep saying 300,000 deaths by Christmas. And we will hit that number, and it seems like we're going to blow past that number, especially if we're going to have over 2,000 deaths a day leading up to that particular point. No, look, I've said it before. This is on Trump. Even with the capitalistic system, the powers of the presidency has the ability to marshal resources to the aid of Americans. He just didn't do it. I don't know if he was too incompetent to do it, whether he didn't know how to do it, whether his ego was too much in order to pull it off. Whatever the reason, he didn't do it. He failed, and all of these Americans are basically dying as a result of it. Trump deserved to lose this race. And the fact that he's screaming about the election being stolen from him, despite the fact that all of these people are dying. 2,800 people died on Wednesday. And Donald Trump is screaming about an election, talking about the election being stolen from him. He's not even doing his goddamn job right now. Why on earth would anybody fight for him to be in a position to continue a job that he's not currently doing with the number of people that are basically losing their lives as a result of his malfeasance? Like, share, and of course, subscribe.